Lots of people there seem to be in denial, in absolute denial of death. Everybody's pretending that death doesn't happen in LA. If you do enough exercise and take enough wheatgrass and have your pill every day, you might not die. Emily Mortimer.
Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. Today we have a special topic. We're going to be talking about longevity, what it means for the social class structure in the United States. I'm recording this live from Henderson, Nevada. And I'm here as part of the first stop of the Analyzing Finance with Nick tour, where I'm going to be going across the country to meet a lot of my audience and the community in person. We've got 3 stops coming up in California in January, in Orange County, San Diego, and San Francisco. And there'll be a link in the description for more details about that. But let's start with the main topic. I've got a special guest here. Shawn, can you tell us a little bit about your background, which tends to be a little bit different than usual guests I bring on this channel?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Nick. It's a pleasure to be on. I'm Shawn Feldman here. I have a background in clinical pharmacy, a doctorate in pharmacy, and a master's in healthcare business. And I've been working in the biopharmaceutical industry my entire career in the oncology space, launched different products, commercialized, done business planning for different oncology therapeutics. But I also hold a passion for advancing human longevity, both health span and lifespan. And I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, and just as disclosure, neither Shawn nor myself are physicians, so please consult your physician before making any major healthcare related decisions. So the first question I'm going to ask you though, Shawn, is aging considered a disease? I mean, it sounds kind of like a weird question on the surface level, but it has major implications from a political and legal perspective on medical and scientific research. So is aging a disease?
Right. This is a fascinating question that touches upon so many different areas. And we just go to the dictionary and we look up what is a disease. It'll tell you that a disease is any sort of aberration from the normal biological processes. So if you think of, any sort of like cystic fibrosis, you've got a mutation in some of your genes that causes you to have this abnormal production of mucus and you have, infections and stuff like that. So that's very clearly a disease. Where it gets a little bit gray is you look at hypertension, the calcification of your arteries. You look at the accumulation of abnormal proteins in your brain, like Alzheimer's disease. You look at the general just wear and tear of your body and like your pancreas and, your rising, your general, insulin intolerance as you get older. Are these things considered, diseases? We consider them diseases, but are they also considered aging? Well, if you ask the FDA, they'll say no. Aging is not considered a disease because it doesn't, there's no defined clinical endpoint. There's no trials set up. And obviously there's no interventions being pursued to address these things. But if you ask somebody who's a longevity enthusiast like me, most of us will probably say, yes, aging is a disease and we should address it as such. Without getting into all your political and religious beliefs, I personally believe, death is a tragic loss of human life and potential. And, we should try to live longer, happier, healthier lives, not just longer, but, have health and reasons to live, have good relationships and things like that.
And the main reason why you want to classify aging as disease, just to clarify it, is because that allows FDA and other sort of academic and government funding to work towards a cure, quote unquote.
Correct. And there actually is a branch of the budget dedicated to, gerontology and advancing aging research, but it's a very, very, very small part of, I believe, the NIH budget. Obviously, if we formally classify aging as a disease, there would be a commercialization pathway, your standard route for a biotech or a pharmaceutical company to create some sort of intervention, test it in a trial. Without getting into how we would, measure that, obviously the gold standard would be a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial where you have a certain set of people receiving an intervention and a certain set not receiving the intervention. And obviously you would have to wait a lifetime to be able to prove if it worked or not. And I don't know about you or me, Nick, but or our audience here, but probably most people would not want to wait a lifetime to have such an intervention approved.
So what are the developments in longevity science currently? Because really all I've seen, and it's been in the fringes, is really just a few very wealthy tech billionaires trying to finance their own ventures to sustain their lives as long as possible. But as somebody who's more closely involved in the space, what is currently the science? What is in the pipeline to be developed to improve human longevity?
Right. So just to give you a quick overview of the history and the landscape of the longevity science. You probably heard of the whole red wine hypothesis and resveratrol, and probably 20, 30 years ago, all these things were kind of being loosely explored. There were some companies made, some of the science, some of the the financial decisions made weren't so great, and basically those things didn't really work. And but fast forwarding to the 2000s, now we have certain companies like Calico, Google sponsored, you have Altos Labs sponsored by Amazon's founder Jeff Bezos and Peter Thiel, the Coinbase founder, really putting their resources into exploring aging, because from a logical standpoint, they're in a good space in life and they probably want to maintain their position. And we'll probably give them the benefit of the doubt if there's an altruistic component to having the whole species live longer, healthier lifespans. In terms of what is the science that is currently being explored and is considered to be the best chance at moving a path forward, the lowest hanging fruit is on this longevity tree is replacement. If you think of us as cars, you wouldn't just throw away your car if you needed new tires or a new engine. You would replace the parts. So we currently do replace certain components of the human body, livers, kidneys, things like that, hearts. There are companies right now that are looking at head transplants and brain transplants and we're replacing certain areas of the body that we can't right now. So that's probably the lowest hanging fruit. Let's get better transplants. Let's get people, instead of having them wait on the list, let's try to regrow organs or have them off the shelf, things like that. In terms of the next thing that's being explored, and this is kind of the Hail Mary, if you ask me, the stasis element. So let's say we're unable to, find that silver bullet, the holy grail. Let's just freeze ourselves until a point in the future when we do have the technology to rewarm yourself and intervene scientifically. And you probably heard of there's a clinic in
Alcor Labs.
Yeah, Alcor Labs in Phoenix, Arizona, which is not too far from here. They've frozen either the heads or the complete bodies of many people. And then the holy grail of this whole thing is cellular reprogramming. Can we get your cells to a younger state? And that's where bulk of the funding is dedicated towards currently. There's these so-called Yamanaka factors. Japanese scientists discovered these, received a Nobel Prize for it. And basically these factors are being explored as a potential way to induce in your cells to induce pluripotent stem cell like sort of state and have these cells just basically be younger and you can live longer. There's different, senolytics, we have senescent cells, these, I have some in my gray hair right now. Basically, anyone who has gray hair. Cells have a Hayflick limit. Basically, they're going to only divide a certain number of times before they should be apoptosed from your body. And there's a branch of science dedicated towards senolytics and helping your body basically get rid of these old proteins, because those old proteins can create a inflammatory environment. They can create cancerous cells. Those proteins can misfold and create problems, in your brain, like for Alzheimer's disease and things like that. So those would be the main things that are being explored right now currently.
What about the calorie restriction studies?
So calorie restriction is probably the most well-documented and well-supported intervention as far as explored mammalian models goes towards extending lifespan, be it C. elegans, rats, other mammalian models. Caloric restriction, without getting into the science of mTOR and all that, appears to be a very, very, very solid pathway towards extending lifespan. However, I don't know about you, Nick, but I don't want to eat, 30, 40% less calories per day. Obviously there's new drugs that have come out. You've probably heard of Ozempic and, the GLP, inhibitors, and, there's different ways to basically artificially, exogenously administer certain interventions that reduce your appetite. Who knows what are the long-term effects of these things? Only time will tell. But yeah, caloric restriction is one of those things that has been well documented in the literature to extend lifespan.
Okay. And the next real question I have then is, what are some of the economic impacts of longer lifespans? Like, from my perspective, there are multiple. The first one is that you are going to have a big boost in economic growth and productivity. According to the research I've done on this, if you average the global life expectancy by 1 year, which is about 73 to 74 years old, so there's plenty of room for upside for that. That adds 16 trillion of GDP. And by comparison, the US is about 30 to 32 trillion in GDP, depending on what kind of inflation factor you use. And as a result, that's almost like adding half of the U.S. economy for adding just 1 year of life expectancy, which is major implications to that. The second thing is it's going to probably increase wealth on the aggregate and wealth inequality on the aggregate, because a lot of the inequality has been simply driven by longevity. If you are an older person and you have investments, they compound every year. Like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, part of the reason why they got so rich is they lived till 99, and Warren Buffett is 90 years old and still chumming along. And so you've got those two as an example, but it's a broader example of older, wealthier investors living longer and being able to compound their wealth before they have to pay estate taxes by transferring down to the next generation. And the fact that the people who are the savers and the investors are going to compound longer than the people who aren't, it's going to naturally create inequality, all things equal. So and there's going to be probably political backlash to that, as we've already seen. The other thing is in terms of politics, you're going to have politicians probably without major reforms in term limits, whether it's in democratic governments or in authoritarian ones, living much longer lifespans. And so you can't really hope that a bad leader dies anymore. You're going to need to have to deal with people potentially being in the scene a lot longer than they would have been in the past. And then there's the Social Security and retirement side of things, where these systems were passed in the Great Depression in the 1930s when the lifespan was well below 70 years old. Now the median lifespan is 78 and rising. And so therefore the solvency of many of these programs is at risk. So on top of these, do you have any other comments on the economic implications of longer lifespans?
Well, obviously, if you're living longer, you're going to be able to work longer, and people may start to make changes in terms of the fields that they pursue. Maybe perhaps people will be more willing to go into advanced education, pursue postdoctoral programs if they think, okay, I'm not just going to work for 40 years. Maybe I work for 60 years. Maybe then it becomes worth it for them to get that medical doctorate degree and do like a 10-year residency and a fellowship and things like that. You may maybe see some of those things. I think people may also have more time to upskill or reskill, depending on what they're in. We're currently going through this kind of Wild West period of AI right now. Some people may think, I'm just going to retire, but if currently, but in the future, if there's some sort of disruptive technology out there and people are going to work longer, maybe that incentivizes them to go back to school, to retool, to learn. And if people are living longer and their brains are kind of more, a little more youthful and they're able to study and things like that, maybe we'll observe a general a rising tide that will lift all ships in terms of people becoming more upskilled. And we can get into this more, but with robotics and AI, maybe some of those more manual labor things will be, in addition to the trend of longevity, this could complement it towards maybe hopefully some of those more dangerous and menial task jobs can get carved out, and the human brain can do what it's really meant to do.
Yeah, and then the other impact is that it blunts the downsides of demographic decline. Like birth rates are going down and people are living longer, you're still going to have that level of productivity even with a smaller succeeding generation. Or people may just have kids later than expected, and this will all balance out. So a lot of people who are spreading fear about like a population collapse, it might not be as much of a problem as anticipated. The next real question we're going to talk about is the statistics on wealth and longevity. There is a major class divide in lifespans. And if you look at the gap between the top 10% and the bottom 10% in lifespans, and I'll post a chart. So the numbers I'm saying here are kind of approximations to show you this. That is a bigger divide than any other variable. Even the famous gender divides that women supposedly live longer than men, that gap is more narrow than the class gap. And if you look at the top 10%, the gap between women and men is less than a year. So it pretty much goes away. The main reason why you have a gender divide in longevity is because the poorest of men in most of the world fail to break 60 years old. And then you have the upper top 10% of Americans live into almost 90, and you have the median at 78, and then the bottom 10% don't really make it to 70. And this is huge and has a lot of implications. I mentioned this in my video about the great wealth transfer, that a lot of millennials and Gen Zers who are expecting big inheritance may not get it until they're 50 or above because their parents are going to live a lot longer than previous generations. But what are your thoughts on the class inequality of lifespans?
Yeah, you touch upon a great point, Nick, here. It's well documented in the literature and just in general that the poor are less healthy than the rich. And there are a number of socioeconomic and other reasons why this may be. I think just purely from a practical standpoint, occupational, some of those more high risk, dangerous manual jobs, have risks associated with them. Some of them are your more white collar office jobs. The worst thing that can happen to you is probably, you have some jet lag or you get a paper cut in the office versus, you're mining in the middle of the desert or trying to fish in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, things like that. So, there's some of those considerations. Also, from an educational standpoint, a lot of health literacy is actually required, especially in the US healthcare system, to receiving care. We don't really have that kind of linear path in some countries. And even if you do have that linear path, there's quite a bit of health literacy required to know about what kind of medicines you're receiving. Just make sure you're not receiving polypharmacy or multiple drugs for the same, double checking. Medical error in some studies is the number 3 cause of death, at least in the United States. So just making sure you're receiving the right care, making sure you're picking good doctors, access to care is another huge thing. If you're poor, you probably don't live in such a great neighborhood. The hospitals probably aren't so good. The doctors probably aren't as good over there. You may need to work harder. You may have less benefits. You may not be able to take days off from work, because you have to do that over time to make ends meet, unfortunately. Whereas, someone who has, the better job, who has a more flexible, maybe salary-based income with more benefits, they have the luxury of living in a better neighborhood, being able to take sick days off, being able to outsource childcare or other things, and be able to go to the gym, go to Whole Foods, buy that organic food. And, these things will just kind of compound with each other and over time. So yeah, that's really a big point that you bring up, Nick.
Yeah, it's also things like extra visits to the doctor and just lower stress. Like people who live higher stress lives, no matter what their incomes are, have greater risk for cardiovascular disease and shorter lifespans in general because the stress starts to degrade you in the inside out. The next question really is based on this. What are some longevity treatments that are out there that the wealthy have that is not accessible to the rest of us?
Yeah, great question, Nick. So there's kind of really 2 buckets of items that I place these into. There are things that are pretty well scientifically, clinically supported by evidence that maybe insurance just doesn't want to pay for, that if you're willing to fork over a couple more bucks that you can pay for. Then there's the stuff that's kind of really more on the fringe that maybe there's scientific rationale, but there's really not any clinical evidence in terms of really big trials and studies that support it. So in terms of things that is pretty low-hanging fruit, you should ask for a lipid NMR. Your primary care physician probably won't know what this is and dissuade you from obtaining this, but basically, you have your LDL-C, but you really need your LDL-P. You need your ApoB. You're going to need, the particle size, the particle number. Cardiovascular disease still is the number 1 killer, even more than cancer in the US. So to the extent that you can get ahead, your LDL-C is a pretty good proxy for, and all this is just proxies for how good your arteries are. The ultimate gold standard would be if you got a coronary artery calcium score, but that's something that is a little bit more invasive, but you can pay for and you can probably obtain. Personally, I haven't gotten one yet. I'd probably like to get one probably when I'm in my 40s and obtain that. Just your general MRIs. If you want to get an MRI every year, just make sure you don't have anything growing. To a lesser extent, some of those scans like a low dose CAT scan, just to detect cancer, and you're always balancing not only the financial considerations for this, but a false positive risk. With the increase in AI and detection methods, probably that false positive risk will be reduced. Your cumulative exposure to radiation and things like that. So you're always balancing things like that. So advanced imaging that insurance probably doesn't want to cover, which is probably overkill at this state. But as Nick, you and I approach our 40s here, we're maybe want to consider some of those early intervention things. There's obviously get your colonoscopy, get your breast cancer screenings, don't smoke, things like that. All that is kind of currently covered in the primary care realm of things. I briefly mentioned some of the stuff that if you want to pay a little more extra for, I always get my A1C measured. I always get my vitamin D measured. These are really cheap things that, you can just get, check the box on your blood test and make sure you get those measured. Also, you could get a DEXA scan or do hydrostatic weighing if you're okay with getting yourself dunked underwater and holding your breath, and you're really getting an accurate measure of your bone density and your body fat percentage, things like that. So you can get those things measured and just track those over time. There are certain markers of inflammation you can measure, like your C-reactive protein, things like that. If you really want to go overkill, you could get a genome-wide analysis and send that to a company, and they can beyond what something like a 23andMe can do, which is just measuring your differences in single nucleotide polymorphisms. You can get a whole genome-wide analysis and have a really in-depth analysis of what are your risk factors for developing certain diseases later in life. In terms of stuff that's on the fringe and less supported, there's kind of longevity clinics popping up all over the country. You can get your hyperbaric O2, you can get your cryo done, infrared light therapy. There's some evidence, scientific rationale as to getting some of these, but very little actual clinical large scale studies that support really you forking over your hard-earned cash towards some of these treatments. You may see, you've heard of Blood Boys and Peter Thiel and the bunch, getting their blood, kind of replaced with the younger people, and that gets into parabiosis. And there are some clinical trials actually being conducted on this. You've probably seen Brian Johnson on YouTube. He spends famously $2 million a year on, various sorts of interventions, some of which I have mentioned, but a lot of it is just kind of experimental supplements, senolytics, NAD, NR, different, liposomal or basically, I would consider this probably kind of a leap currently in terms of what is supported. I think if you were to really, just for the average person, kind of taking a step back here and then, following some of the advice by someone I follow on the internet, Peter Attia, you can follow him. He just released a book. It's really just comes down to a few things that are really, really big needle movers. And ironically, these are actually the cheapest and most accessible, which is just exercise, eat well, don't eat too much, sleep well, don't sleep too much or too little either, and just have a reason to live. Have good relationships, have a family, have a meaningful, passion, whatever it is you're into. There's a lot of evidence that non-clinical things, people who just are married and have families and just have good relationships and are happier, and to your point, Nick, about stress, these people, just tend to live longer in general as well.
Yeah, and just like it seems like to me, this is like a white pill. There really is no like deep, dark conspiratorial secret that's allowing billionaires to live longer than us. It's just there's a few like common sense measures that most people have access to if they really want it. So that's the optimist side. And again, a reminder, neither of us are physicians. So please, before you do any medical treatment, consult with one. The other real question I have is the current developments in longevity science more focused on lifespan or health span?
Yeah, great question. So what we've learned from studying some of these super centenarians or people who live really, really long lives is not so much that they are not getting Alzheimer's disease or they're not getting cardiovascular disease or they're not getting cancer or metabolic diseases. They are getting them. They're just getting them later in life. And when they do get them, they pretty much drop dead. So what we're trying to, and some people may argue, achieve is a rectangular of your curve. You want to like live a really, really great life and just drop dead, because what you want to avoid, and this is what we currently have, is you kind of live an okay life, and then in the last 8 weeks of your life, you spend 80% of your bills of your medical bills in that period because you're just kind of hanging on to very little, and you're in a hospital. You're not really experiencing a great quality of life to begin with. So a rectangularization is probably what we're ultimately trying to achieve. If you ask a human longevity enthusiast such as myself or other members of the community, obviously we want an indefinite plateau. Getting back to your question, are the longevity treatments trying to delay disease and or delay death? From what we can tell, and in terms of the people who live the longest, it's really both. If you're able to delay the disease, you are able to delay death as well.
Yeah, and speaking of death, it seems like back in ancient times you had people living to 100 plus. You've seen a lot of the life expectancy gains mainly from declining infant mortality, decline of young people dying in wars and violence, and just people being able to delay deaths from things such as you mentioned, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's and diabetes and those kind of things. However, it seems like there seems to still be an implicit cap at about 125 years old. Like we haven't really seen anybody break that, and the longest person was a woman in France, lived to about 122. Why haven't we really been seeing any gains in terms of the ceiling of human life? Is it just because everything just starts to break down beyond a certain level? Or is there research and potential to extend lifespans to 150 years and beyond?
Right, you bring up a great point, Nick, and it does basically appear at this point that there is a hard cap in terms of our biologically pre-programmed lifespan of being about that 120 mark. And it's interesting, and we can pull up this chart. You can see different mammals, based off their size, tend to live a little bit longer. For instance, you look at a rat, it'll only live, a couple years or at the most. And you look at, a big whale or an elephant, these things a whale can live 200 years or more. Then there are these kind of abnormalities, these anomalies, like the lobster. Technically it could live forever if it's not even eaten by a predator. And then there's like the naked mole rat, and the elephant, aforementioned, has certain genes that enable it to not have cancer, as with the naked mole rat. Humans are actually another outlier on this trend. Despite us having the mass, somewhere between like a dog and a horse, we're able to live to quite a long period. And again, if you pull up that chart, you'll see it's kind of like an anomaly on that curve. So currently, the hard cap does appear in terms of our hard encoded genomes, barring any crazy X-Men mutation, to be 120 years. The current treatments, again, as stated, are probably intended to do both. If you can delay, those diseases, you're probably going to delay death as well.
But like, is there any progress on extending us beyond the 120 mark?
Right. So in terms of what's being currently explored, we talked about, the cryo and that being kind of a Hail Mary, and really the Holy Grail being the cellular reprogramming. If I were a betting man, which, and in some ways we kind of all are in terms of how we spend our resources and what we're pursuing in life, really the cellular reprogramming is where I would place my bets. Other things like, the senolytics, the telomerase, the resveratrol, all these things have kind of been less explored now just because of the failures and the studies and the companies. So if I were to place my bets, that's where we kind of want to be. But those two stopgaps are there just in case.
All right. Well, thank you, Shawn, for joining us. Do you have any final things you'd like to say before we end this episode?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick, for having me. Thank you, audience here, for supporting the channel as always. Just a couple, things to keep in mind. I encourage everyone, regardless of, your political or religious or other affiliations, to try to live a healthier, longer life. I think we can all agree that, just having more time with your loved ones and being able to have more healthier, more able-bodied experience, and just do the things you love to do for a longer time are great. So, just go for that run, go pursue those relationships, those meaningful ones, and if we're having longer lives, maybe people will make better decisions about, how they want to show up in life, and how we treat our environment, and just, the next generation, instead of kind of a quick pump and dump, which is how some, maybe less philanthropic people may view how they want to live their lives. So I encourage everyone to, really the topic of human longevity seriously, and it's really kind of a tragic loss of life and relationships and human potential when we do lose someone. The inverse of that is, you gain so much when we're able to live longer, happier, healthier lives. There are a number of organizations that you may want to consider exploring if you're really interested in this type of material. From a kind of legislative, nonpartisan standpoint, there is the A4LI group, Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. We'll leave links to any of these things. This group is one that I'm a volunteer for that is interested in advancing legislation to explore longevity research, increase funding, things like that. So there's also lessdeath.org. There's Methuselah Foundation, in addition to all the other companies. These are some of the more grassroots type of organizations that if you're interested in getting involved with, the Longevity Biotech Fellowship, that's one that I'm involved with. Nick, from your standpoint, there's probably a number of organizations like JP Morgan Healthcare Conference and more investor type of companies and conferences like that.
Yeah, that's like the leading JP Morgan San Francisco is like the leading like investor focused conference on healthcare and biotech in the country.
Right. So yeah, just it's been a pleasure to be on the show here, and I'll turn it back to you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you guys all for watching. And if you like more of these type of interviews where I bring on guests who may not directly be involved in the world of finance, but offer a perspective that connects how major changes affect the markets and the economy and how we all are living, please leave in the comments. And also, what are your thoughts on longevity? Would you want to live to 200 if you can? Do you think that somebody born today will make it past 150 years on average? And are there any other crazy longevity extending techniques that you've heard of that we have not mentioned? I'd love to make this a discussion with all of you guys. Please leave your comments. And I look forward to seeing you guys again in a future episode. Thank you for watching.
Cheers.